Tim, what's one area of your diet that's changed since doing the research for the new book?
Well, there are many. I guess I probably have changed my breakfast quite a lot. Is the first thing I've noticed. So I've done away with the muesli, granola breakfast with the low-fat milk and the orange juice. And I've now gone for a high-fat yogurt, nuts and seeds, and lots of black coffee. It's definitely, I think, the most obvious change to my diet. I have less fish as well than I used to. There are lots of little things, really, that within categories I'm choosing different foods and avoiding things that I thought were healthy and are not as healthy. And I've changed in a bit also not just what I eat, that how I eat, timing of my meals and things like this. So, it's part of a sort of ongoing experiment, I'd say, rather than I found the definitive best way to eat. But it's definitely evolved a lot in the 6 years since I started writing.
Well, let's take some time and really pick this apart, because I'm curious about the nuances when it comes to your diet. And I think a good jumping off point to get into some of the nuances is to talk about a typical day of eating for you. So let's start with breakfast. You talked about changing up your breakfast. So let's talk about when you eat and what you eat in a typical day.
Well, there isn't really a typical day now, because that's the other. I do often tend to mix things up. And so this week, for example, I've realized that I'm pretty much not having breakfast. So most of the week I've actually not had breakfast, and I've had my lunch between 12 and 1 o'clock. So, or you could say my breakfast has been a couple of black coffees, depending on your definition of breakfast. So that's one thing that's really changed quite a lot. I used to be fairly regular in saying, well, I have to have something to eat before I go to work, or I do some exercise, or I get on my bike or do things. So now definitely made that shift. And I think that's one of the interesting things, which is a pity, because I actually quite enjoy breakfast as a meal. And so it's this trade-off between pleasure and filling time and feeling more energized. So it's still a work in progress as I'm trying to work out what actually suits me best, and whether, I do things differently at the weekends or in weekdays, and depends whether I'm working at home or I'm cycling to the university. So, but when I do have breakfast, it's generally, I try and have it later. So I would have it around 10 or 11 o'clock, so that I've given my chance to have a longer overnight fast. And it's generally a high fat and low carb breakfast. That's quite different to my old breakfast 6 years ago that I was having. And I think I tend to avoid too much bread as well. But, whereas in the past, bread used to dominate. As well as my muesli, granola, I would, have some toast. And that's, I do that rarely now. And if I do, I'm picking specific types of bread as well. So I'm fussier about if I have bread. So my lunch, I would often just have a sandwich, and I would pick a healthy looking bread that will look like granary bread with seeds on it, or a malted loaf. And I'm much more suspicious of those kind of breads now that look healthy, but actually underneath it are not, because I've realized that in healthy looking breads, there's a tenfold variety in the amount of fiber that they actually contain when you drill down into behind the label. And they all have all kinds of deceptive labeling on them, trying to get you to buy them. Names like wheat germ and whole grains and things that are actually pretty meaningless, but all make you try and make you believe that is the wholesome thing to eat. But in the end of the day, if there is a label, and a lot of them don't have to have labels on bread, particularly if it's made from frozen in the shop, I've learned to look at the fiber carb ratio of breads, and in the book I actually went to the detail of logging them all out and realizing that they do vary a lot, between a sort of optimum bread that has a ratio around 4 carbs to 1 of fiber, to what you commonly see is ones of around 20 to 1, where it can look like a brown healthy bread, but it actually has about the same ratio as a bagel or a croissant. So I'm perhaps much more cynical really about food, I think, now. And that's it means I'm a bit fussier. And the way to get your own bread is obviously to make your own. Is undoubtedly the way you know exactly what goes into it is to make it yourself at home. And I've started doing that since writing the book. So I make my own sourdough, and I tend to have it with a decent proportion of rye, which of all the grains tends to be the one that has the greatest amount of fiber, is best for my gut health, and gives me the lowest sugar peaks. But I always add in many different grains to give me diversity as possible. So yeah, I've become a bit of a bread snob, if you like. And when I do go to Paris or something for a couple of days, I do have this difficulty, picking up that croissant with the same gusto that I did 6 years ago. But of course, you've got to eat them occasionally, but make sure you're not going to have them every day, because they'll definitely not be good for you.
Let's talk more about that time-restricted eating piece. You mentioned over the last period of time, this is something you've adopted, eating later in the morning or eating around lunchtime. What is science showing us when it comes to eating this way that's made you make this switch?
Well, the data's only come in the last couple of years, really, that shows us that we've known for a while that in animals, if you change the timing windows, you can alter their metabolism and you can alter what appears to be their health. So there have now been a number of human studies in relatively small numbers of people, but well controlled, to show that changing that timing window will, so that you actually eating in a smaller time and fasting for a longer time, but keeping roughly the same amount of food. Eating with a longer fasting window reduces your sugar peaks, you pushing out less insulin, you're getting lower fat peaks, you're getting rid of your fat quicker, you're lowering your blood pressure, and you're improving your metabolic health. And some of the studies, not all of them, show that you can get some modest weight reduction as well. And so if you take all of those small studies together, you're generally showing a healthy pattern for most people that increases as you increase the fasting time. And the data is quite convincing that if it suits you to do it, then it's a pretty easy way to improve your metabolic health if it does fit in with your lifestyle. Now, what those small studies haven't shown is whether you can actually sustain that long term, and whether, because if it's not sustainable, there's no point doing it just for a few weeks. It's not going to be a really effective instant weight loss program. And most of the ones that have produced weight loss have combined it with calorie restriction, which is not something I'm interested in personally. I think it's, it's always going to end with a rebound. So, that's what I'm experimenting with, and I'm working out what suits me best. But so far, modest restriction of this time seems to work pretty well for me. So eating in this 10-hour window, I don't find particularly difficult, and it seems I have more energy after it. So it's looking like this could be my long-term way to go. And interestingly, we've just initiated this mass study called the Big If study, which we're launching this week in the UK to look at about 500,000 people on the Zoe Health Study app, to try and get them all to do this sort of mass community program of all changing their eating windows. And interesting, some people were going to eat early and some people were going to eat late. And I think that's the other interesting question, because the data so far show that if you can eat early and fast late, you tend to have some advantage. But most of those studies have been done in younger people, not older people. So we don't know whether that applies to women or people aged over 50, or people going through the menopause, etc. And so that's really what we're trying to find out. And I think the practicality, sorting out how you do this for your life long term, is much more important than some minor metabolic gain that would be impossible to sustain. So if you told me I couldn't eat after 4 p.m., I would not be able to adhere to that diet. It wouldn't fit in with my social life. It would cut into my enjoyment of food, all kinds of things. So I would just say, well, stuff that, I'm not doing it. So I think this is what I'm interested in now, is moving from the theoretical science that's been done in highly controlled studies of 25, 30 people, to seeing what happens when you take it into these mass community studies in the population. And that's really going to be some real fun to see what that shows.
That will be fascinating. And you quickly touched on the calorie restriction piece, and this is something I wanted to get into with you. So for time-restricted eating, we're generally having the same or around the same amount of calories within that tighter window. Let's talk about expanding that window, not having a window specifically, but lessening the calories, and talking about what research is showing. You mentioned quickly there the fact that it's not sustainable, people are going to bounce back, but there are people talking about the longevity benefits of cutting down on calories. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so obviously, we've had a couple of decades now of people starting with, rodent studies and then some short-term human studies about how if you restrict calories, you potentially improve your metabolism and potentially longevity. Now, there's no doubt that that works in animals, particularly small animals, insects, etc., to quite an extent. No one's proven that it increases longevity in humans. The short-term trials do show that you can improve metabolic health with, like, an intermittent fasting that includes calorie restriction, which is what the old term of intermittent fasting used to be. You just don't eat anything for 24 hours and then, perhaps a couple of times a week, and then you eat normally the rest of the time. But when you compare, say, a several week study where one group is doing calorie restricted intermittent fasting and the other one is doing just time restricted intermittent fasting, or where one is doing, where both groups are calorie restricting and one's doing it within a time window and the other isn't, both groups get metabolic improvements. And the advantage of metabolically of time restriction is actually smaller than the calorie restriction, but is much more sustainable. So there have been relatively few studies where you're not comparing against calorie restriction. And in a way, it was quite tough for restricted time eating to show an improvement when you'd already cut the calories and the body was in a different state. So you got the body in a starving state and then you're fiddling with the time windows. It's perhaps not surprising that you didn't get that much of a significant improvement on top. And that's what a couple of studies have shown. So it's a bit complicated, but just to recap, yes, intermittent fasting works to improve your metabolic state, and that's by calorie restriction. But I don't believe that's, for most people, sustainable. And I think they will regain, those metabolic factors and their weight when they stop. Time restricted eating is not as effective in quantitative terms in the metabolic health, but it does have some benefits, but is much more sustainable. And so that's why I'm interested in it. Now, whether either of these have longevity benefits, I think it's too early to tell, but there's reasonable expectation that if you improve all your parameters like blood pressure and your blood sugar levels, blood fat levels, that's going to help you live longer.
I think for a lot of people, what brings them into wanting to eat better, eating cleaner, is weight loss. And we know that if somebody gets into time-restricted eating, they improve their metabolic health. Generally, if they have weight to lose, that's going to be a catalyst to help with that. But what other things within the food paradigm would you recommend to somebody if they're having trouble losing weight?
I mean, some people are advised doing a couple of weeks of calorie-restricted intermittent fasting to kickstart the process. And I don't think there's any empirical data on that. It's just rather anecdotal as a way to do it. That as long as it doesn't last too long, then you might be able to do that. Now, many of these studies have shown that even without calorie restriction, some people do lose weight. Some people don't, some people do. And I think the first thing to do is to just say, well, some people might be more susceptible, others not. And I think there's an individuality about that. But that's the first thing to do. The other thing is that time-restricted eating, just by making you think about not eating outside your windows, generally does reduce your energy intakes slightly. Because if you think about it, you're not going to grab that cookie or that bit of cheese just before you go to bed, because your brain says, okay, no, I need to have a decent fasting interval. You're not going to have that sugary drink, out of hours, if you know what I mean. So I think it's quite a good discipline that means that most people will be intaking less in a very gradual way that doesn't upset their body and stress it and doesn't cause any rebounds. So I think that's true. But I think how you eat is only one part of the equation. And I think we know that you want to do other things to improve your weight that will also help. So what you eat is still of the primary importance here. And for me, the number one thing is to eat for your gut microbiome and have that as the core of, say, well, if your gut microbes would like it, then generally it's good. And you should avoid as much as possible ultra-processed foods because they're bad for your gut microbiome. And we know that calorie for calorie, the fact of processing means it's going to make you hungrier, it's going to make you more tired, it's going to give you more sugar peaks, more inflammation, etc. And so, in a way, if you simply combined time-restricted eating with a policy to really reduce your eating of ultra-processed foods, most people will find they should be able to lose some weight gradually over that time. And I think it's important to not try and tell people to lose weight rapidly, because I think that is a diet is basically just setting yourself up for failure, because your body is designed to bring you back to that baseline and probably overswing. So people who are interested in weight loss, I think it's really realizing this is a gradual, sustainable change over years you need to do. And there isn't a quick fix that's going to work. It's all about training your body to eat at different times, getting your metabolism much more efficient. It's about realizing that you're eating foods that are good for your microbes, which are producing the chemicals to keep your metabolism optimum and your immune system optimum. And it's about avoiding nasty chemicals through the ultra-processed foods and that are triggering your brain to overeat and do other things. So it's a sort of relearning of our nutrition, really. And for me, it's about forgetting all that nonsense about calories and fats and even sugars. I think we've just gone too reductionist on this and need to take a much more holistic view of food. And because, you can talk all day about macronutrients and protein levels and whatever, but in the end of the day, you've got to replace something with something. And we have to eat something and drink something.
I love this idea of eating for the microbiome. We did get into this in great detail last time we talked. I'm sure we're going to get into it again, at least somewhat here. But one thing that comes to me as you're talking about that is carbohydrates. So if we're going to eat for the microbiome, we're going to want to eat a lot of different colored plants, a lot of different plants, which generally plant foods are higher in carbohydrates. That's a general statement. But when it comes to weight loss, one of the things typically people do when they're trying to lose weight is cut down on carbs. So interesting paradigm there where a lot of people are going to probably try and cut down on carbohydrates to lose weight, but that's where a lot of the fiber and polyphenols are to feed the microbiome. So I'm curious how you think about all that.
Yeah, well, it comes back to this idea of oversimplifying diets and regimes to sort things out. And I think, we've got to this stage where nutrition is a bit like a religion. Are you in you're in the low fat diet group, or you're in the low carb diet group? And, within fats, there are hugely healthy fats that we should be having masses of, and there's some very unhealthy fats we should be avoiding. Similarly, in carbs, there's ultra refined carbs that starchy, stodgy ones, which are just like eating sugar, and there's super healthy carbs that provide all the polyphenols and the fiber for our bodies. And, pretty dumb if we lump them all together and treat them as one. We've got to start being much more discriminatory, understanding much more about these, and realize that, it's not about 3 or 4 items. We're dealing with 30,000 different chemicals in the foods we eat every day. We're dealing with, 50,000 circulating metabolites in our blood and chemicals produced by our microbes. It's intensely complicated. So I think we need to think in much more holistic terms rather than trying to just say carbs versus fats. What do you do about it? And this is the trap that people fall into. Yes, keto diets, for example, for the people that can support them, do allow some people to lose weight quite rapidly. But if they maintain that and they're having really high fat levels of 70%, they really haven't got much room on their plate to keep their gut health adequate. And particularly if they have a sort of mental aversion to carbs and plants, then they're going to be in real trouble, because they'll be very soon have a very denuded diet that isn't going to be something that's going to sustain their long-term health. So that's the trade-off you've got to make. And that's, again, this danger of short-term dieting has a very different plan, I think, to long-term maintenance of health. And I think that's what I'm much more interested in, is trying to teach people that, for your gut health, doesn't matter if you want to, there's no particular limit for me about fats in your diet, as long as you can get 30 plants a week on your plate. Okay, by all means, put yogurts and meats on that. I don't mind. Lots of cheese, that's fine. But, the key is you still got to have that diversity, and it's not about thinking that broccoli is the same as rice. They're very different, and it doesn't have to be huge amounts of it. And realize that also nuts and seeds are something that can be high in fats, but also are typically plants. that also have some of the beneficial properties. So I think it's all about sort of re-educating people in different ways to not think in quite sort of binary terms about food.
The latest YouTube stats are still showing that over 90% of the people that are watching this channel aren't subscribed. If you're one of these people, you've been enjoying the episodes, please take a second and subscribe below. This is going to help the community continue to grow and help the show continue to bring on the biggest guests. Thank you ahead of time. Continue to enjoy this episode. Tim, with the current situation of the world, we have all this technology, science, and we have this great understanding of, human evolution in our history. Yet we can't agree upon the optimal diet for our species. Why is this?
I guess because we're looking for a simple solution. And humans love simple solutions, like they love meals in a pill or, black and white advice. And humans are complex and food is even more complex. And I think this is why we're struggling to fit all this amazing difference between people into one box. And so it's quite normal that we see the huge diversity of diets all around the world, and people have survived on these for millions of years. And we're trying to sort of compress it into our modern view of there is one diet that fits all. And it turns out that's actually not true. And we're much more flexible and adaptable than I think people give humans credit for.
An inconvenient truth, because it would be easy if we could all just eat a certain diet and move on from the food thing and just go on living our lives. But given the situation, somebody who doesn't have, we're in unique positions where we have a lot of time to research and dig at different options and to experiment. But for the person out there who's busy, they have a family, they have, a job, and they can't really dig into the research, but we're definitely in a crisis right now with our health. Chronic diseases are skyrocketing and we have a major problem. And a lot of people want to make this shift, but they're confused. How do they go about starting to get that inertia and head in the right direction?
Well, I think it's about thinking it not as an obesity crisis, but actually a food crisis, that we've lost touch with what real food is and what food is good for us and what's bad for us. How to evaluate food, we've lost touch with that. And so it's about re-educating people. And what I like to do in my books and talks is really to start thinking of food differently. It's not about fuel, it's not about calories, it's not about fats versus sugars. And people should start thinking about it as what is the best food to put in your body to help your gut microbes. And if you make that shift in thinking, you're not going to go far wrong. If you can understand what your gut microbes like to eat to keep them healthy and you healthy, then actually you've got a pretty good blueprint for all kinds of different diets wherever you are in the world. And I think that's where I'm moving to. If you just wanted to get a very simple message out there, it's don't eat as, governments tell you to eat, or manufacturers or labels on supermarket or advertising. Don't go for quirky diets that restrict what you eat. Go for what microbes want you to eat, and in order to be healthy. And I think if you do that, then the rest comes much more easily. So it does mean a little bit of education about our bodies and, this new organ that's suddenly come into our lives, which we didn't know 10 years ago really was there, that all of us have. And all of us just need to know more about that organ so we know how to feed it right. And if we do that, then everything else just slots into place.
Feeding our gut microbiome, probably not the answer most people were expecting, but one I wholeheartedly agree with. And I want to get into the nitty gritty here. Again, this is going to be big for a lot of people who don't have the time to get into all the nuances. But let's start with this. Let's pick this apart. So somebody that wants to start eating for the gut microbiome, how do they begin?
I have 4 basic rules for people which they can remember as a way to help their gut microbes and as a general food rule. The first is to try and eat 30 different types of plant every week. And remember that plants are not just kale, they are nuts, seeds, herbs, spices, and things you wouldn't normally think of as plants. And some people even think of coffee as a plant. So, you could also include red wine. Now, the second rule is to have regular fermented foods as a small amount every day, not only cheese and yogurt, which everyone knows about, but fermented milk, kefir, kombuchas, fermented tea. And then, of course, you've got sauerkrauts or Korean kimchi, which are fermented vegetables. Then the third thing I tell people is to try and pick these plants that are high in polyphenols. And these are the defensive chemicals that all plants have to some extent, but they range really widely between them. So the ones with the high polyphenol counts are really good for your gut microbes, and they're the colorful ones, the ones that have strong, often slightly bitter tastes, and you find them in nuts, you find them in seeds, you find them in berries, you find them in high-quality olive oil, you find them in coffee beans, you find them in green tea, and it's the plant that has the red bits, the really big colors. It's more like the purple carrots compared to the light orange ones. They're the three positive rules, and the fourth rule is to try and help your gut microbes out by not having too many ultra-processed foods, which comes with a whole range of chemicals, which they find hard to deal with. And also, ultra-processed generally deprives them of nutrition and fiber. And if you follow those basic rules, you can't go far wrong.
Let's go a bit deeper into some of the nuances here. Going back to the polyphenol piece. So you mentioned eating foods high in polyphenols to feed the gut microbiome. Let's take that story a little bit further. So we're eating these foods, the gut microbiome is going to get these polyphenols. What happens next?
Well, the gut microbes break down the plants that you're eating, and particularly the fibers, and this releases these polyphenols as well as other nutrients in the fiber. And it acts as like rocket fuel for the gut microbes, which allows them to reproduce and also produce their own powerful chemicals, which medicinal chemicals or nutrients, which are key for our body. So those chemicals get passed. Once they've got the polyphenols, they've got the fiber, they're then passed to the immune cells lining the gut and other receptors around the body, and transmitted through the bloodstream, through our nervous system, all kinds of pathways we're only just beginning to discover to keep our body in its perfect metabolic state. They will send signals to the brain to stop us overeating. They will send signals to prevent depression through chemicals like serotonin. But their main influence is this interaction with our immune system, which most of it is actually in our gut, just where our microbes are, and that's not by chance. So the immune system and the gut microbes are constantly talking to each other through these little chemical signals and sort of feeding off each other. And that is really important for our body because that starts to affect our long-term health, how we react to everything from COVID to autoimmune disease, to food allergies, but also as a preventive measure against cancers, against aging. And there's an increasing knowledge that this is really important. So, the more polyphenols, the more variety of these chemicals that you're feeding your microbes, the more species you can propagate and the more healthy chemicals they're producing, really to keep you in balance. So that's why we think polyphenols are important. And there's a group of them that actually have been shown to reduce inflammation as well. So they reduce the stress on the body generally, and particularly our blood vessels. And that's why they used to be called, before we knew about the gut microbiome, they used to all be called antioxidants, which was a very vague general medical term about how they could mop up the sort of side effects of general metabolism, which otherwise would build up and cause stress to the body. But now we know much more about it. We know that the humans themselves, we can't process the polyphenols without the microbiome. and they do produce considerable energy for the microbes. So it's their sort of special superfood, if you like.
And I would assume the second step of building up that gut microbiome would be integral to happen before the polyphenols. Not that you're going to wait to eat polyphenols, but because the gut microbiome is going to eat the polyphenols and create all these health benefits, if we don't have a good microbiome to start with, I'm assuming we're not going to get the same results.
I think to some extent that's true, but we don't really know this interaction between the different states of the microbiome and how they can process foods. But we do know in general that if you lack certain microbes, you can't fully get all the nutrients from the plants or the foods as well. So we do know the dangers of people who go long periods of time on very unhealthy diets, low in fiber, can sort of wipe out a lot of their good microbes, and it can be hard to get them back into your gut through just introducing a few specific foods. It takes much longer, we think, to reintroduce good microbes than it does to suppress bad ones, suppress the inflammatory ones that we see with people on regular junk food diets. So this is a very new science. There's an anecdotal story is which I wrote about in the books. Is I was wanted to do this study of eating 10 days at McDonald's to see what effect it would have on my gut microbes. And many people already know this story, but it turned out that the volunteer who came forward to do the study instead of me was my son, who was really keen on McDonald's and desperate for cash as well, free food for 10 days as a student. So he did this, but despite wanting to quit at 4 days, which I told him he couldn't do, because I wasn't a responsible father, he carried on for 10 days, but he lost, according to this N of 1 study, 40% of his gut diversity in that time. And in the subsequent years, I've tried to feed him up, but he's never got back to that original starting level. And so people who do have prolonged periods with no fiber at all, with very poor diets, we think may struggle a little bit to do this. But that's obviously an extreme case, and it's just an N of 1. And I think we can change most people's gut microbes for the better. And we know the story from, there's a similar story about the ability to digest seaweed. So naturally, people in the US and Canada, the UK are not, don't have those microbes that can break down seaweed and get the nutrients from them. But if they live sometime in Japan or maybe, in Vancouver with lots of sushi restaurants, or San Francisco, they would pick up the microbes from the food, and eventually they would then have the capacity to break down seaweed. So I think you can train your gut to do this, but it does take a bit longer than people think. It's not a sort of immediate that any microbe, can suddenly retrain itself to eat a different product.
You talked about there picking up different microbes from different foods. Is that where the first step you talked about, eating a diversity of foods, is that how that fits in? So you're eating different foods and they're going to have different populations of microbiomes on them that are going to repopulate the gut?
Not really. I think it's more, yes, there's something about eating these foods that have microbes, but most of those microbes on the plant, say if you don't fully wash it or just in the soil, aren't ones that generally live within your gut. And so you have to try and cultivate them. You hope that there's a few seeds lying around somewhere in your gut, just dormant, because they go dormant with these spores for a long time. And so what you hope is that if you eat this diversity of plants, each plant has hundreds of different chemicals in it. And it may be that this microbe only likes 4 or 5 of those chemicals, but it can be just be titillated by these chemicals as they sense them. And it'll come out of its dormant state and start reproducing and get a niche that builds it up to its its sort of full capacity. And I think that's really what we're hoping for, that because humans never run out of microbes, whatever you do to them, and we know this from people that have barium enemas or they go through these cleansing processes. You can never get rid of your micro species, and they don't tend to change that much. So we think really they're just going down to very small levels, and it's how you sort of coax them back up again so that they can actually be visible, we think is what's happening. But, again, some of this is guesswork because it is so new. So I want to stress that it hasn't all been studied, infinite detail. We're just trying to work all this through. But certainly it's the idea of good bugs versus bad bugs is something that we're coming to, as well as this concept of diversity, and both the number of species you've got and the ratio of the good guys to the bad guys, I think is becoming the way we're looking at gut health in general. But the 30 plants a week gives you sufficient variety of chemicals to keep all your microbes happy and reproducing and producing their good stuff for you. I think that's the basic principle. Whereas if you're only eating if potato chips, you're only a vegetable, then you've only got a few microbes that can really survive off that. The others are living off fat and a bit of the meat, and so the rest are struggling to survive.
Well, let's come back to the story of your son. You mentioned it being such an extreme thing, and unfortunately, in today's day, for a lot of people, that might not be so extreme. I mean, having it every day for 10 days, I'm sure that's a little bit far for most, hopefully. But what I'm really curious about is, because this is, people are eating a lot of processed food like that, and there's so many different areas, and I want to dig into this in a little bit, that are the fourth pillar you talked about, things that are actually killing the microbiome. But we know antibiotics have been heavily prescribed in more recent years and had an effect on people's microbiomes. So what I'm getting at here is, what did you do to help your son rebuild that diversity? You mentioned it came down 40%, because I think this can be really helpful for people if they've been eating junk food or if they've been on antibiotics and they feel like they're not in a good position right now and they almost feel like they're at ground zero. How did you help your son rebuild that?
Well, it's the same principles really for everybody. And we know that generally people with very poor gut microbes, poor gut health, do the best when they are transferred onto a good diet, as opposed to improving someone who's already pretty high. So you can reduce the inflammation pretty quickly by just giving a variety of salads. So I used to send him, boxes of fruit and vegetables, and he played on my guilt all the time when he said, "I haven't got money for vegetables, Dad. Can you send me some more money?" So that always worked. I got him eating regular yogurt, full-fat yogurts, and I tried to dissuade him from having junk food, more than once or twice a week, which was very different because he was a student at the time when they had terrible diets, and they on very, very small budgets. And really that's how, and also got him to eat less meat, because he was eating generally poor quality meat because he couldn't afford the good stuff. And in general, meat per se is not particularly bad for your gut microbes unless it's highly processed, but even good quality meat stops you putting extra plants on your plate. So that was a real consideration to say, listen, start having some meat-free meals, start having less meat on the plate, extra plants all the time. So that's what I've been sort of nagging his message. And I've got him to do a personalized nutrition test. He's just done it with Zoe, the company I co-founded, to also understand, his ratio of how much fats to sugars he should be eating. And with his microbiome tests, we will be giving him more precise advice about which foods he can eat to boost particular microbes that we know are healthy, and which foods would suppress the bad ones as well. So I think we're slowly getting there, but I think I was just illustrating it. It can be tough, and as you said, there are, probably, tens of millions of people in the Western world who have nearly all the time this ultra-processed diet, and it is an absolute crisis. And that's why I said it's a food crisis rather than an obesity crisis, because it is literally killing the microbes, and it is making obesity and diabetes inevitable.
When I asked you about rebuilding in the protocol, I noticed you didn't get into probiotics or prebiotics. And these are products that have hit the market hard. And I know from your book, you're not a fan in general, at least, of supplements. So talk about, it's pretty evident by your answer, but talk more about that. Are those ever products that you recommend to people or use yourself?
I've used them a few times myself, particularly when I had, I take many less antibiotics than I used to 10 years ago before I understood the gut microbiome. But I've been forced a couple of times in the last 10 years to take a course of antibiotics for chest infections and things. And then I've taken a combination of natural probiotics, which I always prefer, which is my go-to kimchi's, kefirs and kombuchas for 3Ks, and have tried people's suggestions of sort of proprietary probiotics in that time. But when I looked at the literature, I haven't been convinced that for people who aren't unwell, probiotics make much of a difference. And that's probably because we're all incredibly different in our gut microbes, very individual. And when you pick a commercial probiotic, there's just a handful of species that are used in this field that have been approved and everything and have an official patent and etc. So the chances that those particular microbes will fit into my community or your community or anyone's is actually rather small and have a major impact. We know that they do affect the metabolism to some extent, and they do work in people with severe disease. For example, people with gut problems, infections, young kids, elderly people, they are useful. But my view of reviewing all the evidence is that there's very little evidence they help normal people prevent illnesses. And I'd much rather people took probiotics in natural food because, they're alive because you can smell them. And so it's not some fake rip-off stuff that's been hanging around in a warehouse for 3 years. And also you get a greater variety generally of species when you pick probiotics in real food. So I think they're the reasons that I'm generally not in favor of probiotic. I don't tend to believe it, with some exceptions. And there are some studies of people with depression or irritable bowel syndrome where the evidence is better. But for normal people just saying, I want to take a regular probiotic for my general health, I think until they're personalized, I don't think they're going to be very useful unless people experiment with, multiple different ones, and do test themselves. But I think it's more like the age of personalization. I think we are going to move in the next 5 years to better probiotics that are reflecting the new science. And there are a few that I think we're going to see in the next year or so that have come out of the latest science rather than 100-year-old science that we've known about, these ones in yogurt or these fermented foods, ones that do affect our physiology. And so I'm not saying never, I'm just saying at the moment, for most people, I don't recommend them. But I think things are moving very fast. So I hope I'll be able to change my mind soon. And we've got some interesting data that we're collecting as part of the Zoe project. Now we've got 30,000 people's diet and microbiome results that we can start to link up some of these exciting microbes that are affected by diet and health. But it takes a long time to go from that discovery to putting this into a commercial product. And so there's perhaps about a 5-year delay between the science and actually delivering these things, which is always a bit frustrating for people like me who are rather impatient.
We spent a lot of time now digging into how to build up the gut microbiome, but let's hone in on the details of pillar number 4 and talk about some of the biggest players when it comes to things that are having a negative impact on the microbiome, things we want to avoid.
Things you want to avoid. So I'm calling ultra-processed food one item, but obviously it is multiple foods, and it is hard to define. Some definitions include any food that contains more than 10 ingredients that you don't recognize, which I think is a nice one. Others are foods that are only prepared from extracts of other foods. So they're not a combination of real foods together, but they are the extract of some grain, the extract of some bean, the extract of some protein, and they're sort of put together, molded together in a factory and presented to us. Now, the average American has 60% of their energy from these kinds of foods. So they're, and 50% in Canada and the US and UK. So they're pretty ubiquitous. And we believe they're bad for the gut microbes for, firstly, the reason they often have very little fiber. So most of it doesn't reach the actual lower intestine of any value anyway. Most of it is, a lot of it is absorbed early on. And the bits that do reach the lower intestine might include some of these chemicals. The first thing one to think about is the emulsifiers. These are the food glues that do occur in nature, but also are chemically made that stick foods together. So particularly in the food processing arena, you've got lots of these things made in factories that wouldn't naturally go together. So you've got to stick something there to make it get some consistency and stop it just fragmenting. And so we know that at least 3 out of the 5 commonest emulsifiers used have a negative effect on our gut microbes and cause a loss of general diversity and alter the chemical signals that they are producing. So they send off negative inflammatory signals to the body and the brain when they hit. There are some ones that may be fine. We also know that there's actually quite a lot of individual variation. So some people might be super sensitive to these in their gut microbes, and others might be able to have many more of them. So again, I think we're going to see a personalization about which of these very commonly used products in our food system are causing some people real problems. You know, a bit like we used to worry about E-number, additives and all these other things that we really need to pay much more attention to how these chemicals affect our gut microbes. And just the record, they're never studied in any country before they're widely available to hundreds of millions of people. And it's crazy that, they're only tested, for cancer in rats, never for its effect on our precious microbes. So that's one group. The other one that I'm particularly worried about is the artificial sweeteners. And many people have artificial sweetened beverages, the Diet Pepsis, Diet Cokes that are told are perfectly healthy for us. And they are good to reduce tooth problems, tooth decay, undoubtedly. That's a big bonus. But metabolically, the trials are really unconvincing that you switch from a full sugar drink to the diet equivalent. It has any real difference on your metabolism or your weight. And that's rather odd given they're so calorie rich. So we think there are other products in there. And so there's been several studies on aspartame and sucralose, which are the 2 most commonly used sweeteners, showing that first in mouse studies, they can cause damage to mouse guts, and that those transfers can be transferred from one animal to another. And they've also done a limited number of human studies also showing that in some people, not all, they can disrupt the human microbiota as well. Again, the idea that the microbes encounter some chemical that, remember, most of these come from the petrol industry, paraffins, etc., they wouldn't normally be eating. So they're not really adaptive for that. They hit the aspartame molecule and sort of sparks fly and weird chemicals come off. We think that's what happened. It can't really process it, and it seems to upset them. We don't know about the new ones like stevia really, but I think in general we should be wary about it and realize that there might be lots of differences between humans and how we react to them. And the final group are, I think, preservatives that are there to give food its really long shelf life. And generally they tend to be antimicrobial. And so that's a reason to really worry and fear about them. We don't have that much knowledge about them. So it's that lack of good nutrients, the lack of fiber, as we've mentioned, the polyphenols in the plants, they're virtually non-existent in these foods. So there's nothing really good in there. And you've got these increasing sets of weird chemicals that in many of us do have side effects. So it's taken me a while to answer that, but that's my worry. And I think but it's important because I think no one ever focuses on. They're all focused on, is it lower in calories? Is it lower in fat or sugar or salt? And all the evidence now is showing that that's not the main reason. It's these factors that affect our gut microbes. But the other thing is, as been shown in this NIH trial, is they also make you hungrier. And some of that might be the microbes sending off hunger signals, or it might be a direct effect on the brain. And that's one reason that, I think it's the number one enemy. Although, and we know we're all susceptible because they're made to be super tasty. So and we can't do without them completely. So I think, we have to be realistic and work out how we can reformulate them or have such a good basic diet that we can occasionally go crazy and have one of these super tasty but unhealthy meals without it having long-term consequences.
So you've went really in depth on the processed foods, but what about additives within whole foods, things like antibiotics in meats they put in the feed or pesticides on conventional produce? How do those impact the microbiome?
We know that in theory they impact them, and there are lots of mouse and rodent studies showing the effects of both antibiotics and pesticides on rodents. There's really limited data on humans because it's very hard to study humans long term for those effects. And if we take antibiotics, we know that there's again a hugely varied response of humans to a standard dose of antibiotics. Some people microbiome recovers after a therapeutic dose very quickly, but maybe 1 in 3 people will still not have recovered 6 months later. So it's those people we worry about, that if they're getting these tiny doses from cheap meats with antibiotics in them, they could have a long-term effect. And if you extrapolate those to the animal models, that causes obesity and increased allergy. So I think an important message is that antibiotics, whether you take them by mouth, injection, or in a slow amount in your food, have the potential to do you harm. Now, I don't think we know how much harm, and it could be extremely variable between us, so hard to say what the average is. But I do think we should be much more wary about antibiotics in our food system, not just because of antibiotic resistance, but because if people it's a bit subjected to these things nearly every day of their lives, it's quite likely to have an effect that is very hard to see in a human experiment. So certainly it's another reason to move away from cheap processed meats in food and look for equivalents, either going to high quality meats that are free of these products or using meat substitutes. Now, pesticides is another one, and most of the data is on Roundup, which is the most commonly used pesticide in the world, which is actually a herbicide. So it's we use the terms interchangeably, but really the idea is it kills off weeds, and it's healthy for humans, but interestingly, it does alter our gut microbes and means that they then produce abnormal chemicals in the same process, and so can affect our immune systems and our health. And the studies are suggesting that, it is sometimes associated with some strange blood cancers, and several juries have awarded big amounts of money in California for it. But I think my idea is it's likely a very small effect, and people who should be worried are more like young babies and pregnant women. I don't think it has major effects on most of us, but certainly we should be looking for alternatives if they're sustainable and don't completely mess up our food system. So the data is accumulating that they can definitely affect our gut microbes, and I think this individuality is going to creep. There will be some people that will react to it. Maybe those people are the unlucky ones that might get these rare lymphomas. So another reason that we should be switching, as many countries are, to getting organic foods and moving away from some of the foods that just naturally, like oats, contain huge amounts of pesticides just because the way that they're cultivated.
How do you feel about the medicinal mushrooms, things like chaga, reishi? And these aren't mushrooms that we cook up and consume, but we would use them through tinctures or making teas. Are you a fan?
I wasn't convinced that there's hard evidence to support them. I mean, unless you're into the psychedelic mushrooms, where there's definitely an effect that the psilocybin-producing mushrooms definitely have effects, and there are now proper trials showing that they can actually cure depression, anxiety, and potentially schizophrenia, but you shouldn't take them without, supervision and in a very controlled environment. But for the other ones, it was all anecdote, really. I couldn't find hard evidence to support them. But, I'm a big fan of all mushrooms anyway. So, but what was interesting is you often get more nutrients out of them when you have them slightly cooked than you do having them raw. So there obviously will be exceptions to certain chemicals that come out. So just steeping them in tea might give you very different chemicals than if you just fry them in oil or steam them. But I think we're in the very learning stages here, and we should all eat much more mushrooms. So however you consume them, I think it's a good thing. But yeah, I'm paying ridiculous prices for some of them. I think that's more marketing, and just because a mushroom is given a fancy name, rather than its Latin name, I'm not sure I'd pay an extra $20 for.
One of the areas of the book that I really enjoyed is when you got into extra virgin olive oil, and you went deep into that subject and covered quite a bit. So let's talk about why this is such a quote unquote superfood. And some of the area that I found really interesting within that is how we really need to go to the source and figure out quality, because there are these companies out there that are, for lack of a better word, watering down their oils.
Yeah, olive oil was a good one because culturally, the UK and US, Canada hasn't used olive oils. It was only in pharmacies and things, to wash your ears out when I was a kid. And it's only the last 20 years or so that they've become mainstream. And, they're now produced in California and a place like this. But realizing that, there's different grades, and there's a huge difference in the quality for your health just by picking the higher grade ones rather than the ones that have a flashy label, but actually it only says virgin olive oil and just missing that little word extra. And that difference make 100-fold difference to the polyphenol counts just by changing the acidity of the oil and the purity of it. And so that's one thing to look out for. And even when you get to the extra virgin olive oils, which I think is one of the healthiest parts of your diet, and one of the keys to the Mediterranean diet, is the fact that they use so much of this stuff which has fats, which in the old days we used to say was bad for you. Now we're quite happy to say is good for you. But a lot of those is not just the fats, but it's the polyphenols that give it that bitter taste. And a good olive oil it just makes you cough. If you ever have it raw or something, you're tasting it in a bit of bread in the fancy restaurant. That pepperiness, that cough, that shows that is absolutely full of those polyphenols that are good for you. And what I found is investigations show a lot of fraud in the olive oil markets. And so you should always buy your olive oil from somewhere you trust, where it comes from a single place, not a mixture of oils, and where the country of origin, because otherwise it's really hard to trace this stuff, and they could have added in all kinds of impurities. Each country is going to have different rules on how it surveils it, but increasingly around the world, it's really hard to keep food secure. So get your sources, know what it tastes like, and pay a little bit extra for it. It'd be well worth it.
You mentioned the importance there, having that extra word extra in front of virgin olive oil. How does that differ when it comes to processing versus not having that?
Well, it's a bit like the level of processing. It goes from being a sort of relatively unprocessed product to a highly processed product, where they're not only using mechanics, which is what the extra virgin want. They're just pretty much the same way as they've done it for hundreds of years. You just squash it, and the juice comes out, and you get rid of the olive skin. But they start to use chemicals and wash it away, and the pH changes, so they sort of have to change the acidity to extract it. So they're extracting the hard to get stuff, sort of residue from the high quality ones, and that's what they use, and that's even slightly better than the next grade down, which is just olive oil, which is really the scrapings of all the rubbish that you get in any form. So it's bits of the stone, bits of it, and they can add all kinds of other stuff to it. So, but you can simply taste the difference, if you put the three of them together, completely different. But most people don't know that because, there isn't a tradition of olive oil. But in Italy, no one would buy their olive oil from a supermarket. They say only tourists do that. They buy it from someone they know and they go to, and they trust, because they know even in Italy, there's a lot of fraud and sticking labels on Greek olive oil and calling it, Italian and Spanish and Moroccan and, whatever. So lots of trickery around.
And you're a fan of cooking with olive oil, which is different than the common opinion in the health and wellness space. So talk about why this is, because a lot of people say it goes rancid or it goes beyond the smoke point when we cook with it.
Yeah, so when I started researching this, that was very much the mainstream view, is that said, well, yeah, olive oil is good for salads, but, don't use it on cooking because you get this blue-black smoke when you cook with it, and you get these carcinogens coming off. And this was very much the common view of, particularly in America, I must say, US chefs said, okay, you've got to use high smoke point peanut oil, to do anything in high cooking. And this became sort of ingrained in the minds. And so I started looking at it and also spoke to some fat experts. And it transpires that, yes, the smoke points of olive oil are, around 204 degrees to 208 degrees. But you rarely get to that point in normal cooking. So if you're frying something, normally it's 160, 180 degrees in a pan. And so the idea you're going to get all this carcinogen smoke is actually nonsense, unless you're doing really wok frying at high intensity heats. So that, for a start, isn't a problem. And so anything above 200 is fine. And I also found that they were saying, it does go rancid, but you shouldn't keep olive oil for, more than a year, probably more than 6 months. And you should keep it out of the light and, pay attention to it. It's a living product, a bit like wine. It does go off. But, what the other side of the coin is that because it has a lot of saturated fat, it's actually more stable compared to some of these other ones, more vegetable oils that are mixed fats or with polyunsaturates that actually, when you fry with them a lot, particularly if you reuse them, they get very unstable, and then they can produce lots of different chemicals that some of those would be bad. So really, I think we'd gone, I don't know who started these rumors, but they were really false. And in the Mediterranean countries that have the best reduced heart disease, they have the best longevity, they only use one oil, and that is extra virgin olive oil in everything. And they're a lot healthier. And people who tell me you should use coconut oil or peanut oil, well, I don't want all my foods tasting like coconuts and peanuts, and I much prefer that olive oil taste. So, yeah, that's my go-to oil, and I think it's going to be the best for your health.
We know you're a big fan of the olive oil. What other oils would we find in your kitchen?
I do have some high-quality rapeseed oil, so you can get some ones, that are not ultra-processed ones that are actually high grade, and I use those when I don't want to get too much of an olive oil taste if you've got a very refined dish, or if I'm doing has a slightly higher smoke point, so you might want to take it up higher. Avocado oil I have, but it's very expensive, and so I tend not to use that much. But and of course, occasionally, we'll still use the occasional bit of butter if you really want to have an old-fashioned French dish that's a bit of an indulgence, which I can't justify on health grounds, but occasionally tastes better. But I wouldn't do that regularly.
Somebody tuning into this point saying, okay, I want to give my gut microbiome lots of plants, lots of diversity. Why not just forego meat altogether and take that to the extreme and go vegan? And I know you personally, Tim, went on a 6-week journey where you experimented with that and ended up testing and having a B12 deficiency. So for people out there, there are a lot of people in the health and wellness space these days that are adopting a vegetarian, vegan, plant-based diet. Let's talk about why going to that extreme, even when it comes to the microbiome, can be a bit much.
Yeah, well, obviously, we have to realize there are billions of people on the planet who do have a vegan diet, and they live without meat or fish, and are perfectly healthy. And I think what I discovered is that we treat food a bit like religion. So we want these strict rules to say we have to do this, we can't do that. And clearly, for me, a vegan diet wasn't healthy because of the lack of B12, and even taking B12 tablets wasn't enough for some reason to get my levels up, and this affected my blood pressure, etc. So for me, just having meat once a month seems to keep it in check, which presumably our evolution, was geared up to do. Now, I think the danger of people saying, I'm going to go healthy, I'm going to go vegan, is that there are very healthy vegans who eat lots of diverse plants and get their nutrients and really understand what they're doing very well. But there are equally a large, increasing group of vegans who eat lots of ultra-processed foods, lots of meat equivalents, which are very poor quality, with lots of these ultra-processed ingredients and chemicals we talked about, who might also forget about B12 and their iron levels and things that they need to balance up. So I think going all the way vegan is an easier choice than someone like me. People find it strange. Eating meat or fish once or twice a month is a bit odd. But I think increasingly we need to have a more flexible approach to this, which works if you understand the gut microbes. Because when we did this study a while back, we looked at gut diversity and diet, and as well as finding the 30 plants a week being the best point, we found that people who ate lots of plants were as healthy as people. It didn't matter if they ate meat or not. So excluding meat from your diet doesn't make you healthier as long as you're eating lots of plants. So I think that's an important point to make, that it's the plant side of it rather than the meat itself, if it's good quality, that is the factor here. So I think everyone's got to find what they're comfortable with. And of course, we've got, the humane aspect of this, the ethical aspect of animals. We've got the health aspect, and now we've also got the environmental aspect. And I think increasingly people are going to look at these three things together and decide for themselves what they want to do. But I hope more people do have this sort of flexitarian approach that is individualized to their own needs, rather than having these religious groups, the carnivore group, the vegan group, the keto group, and we could have an all-embracing nutritional church.
When it comes to meat, it seems like there's one group within that is head and shoulders above the rest, and that's fish, especially fish like salmon, the fatty fish with the omega-3s. You've dedicated a whole chapter in your book talking about how there's more to that story. So for people out there that are including fish on a regular basis, even up to a few times a week, thinking this is a great thing for them, let's share the other side of the story.
Yeah, so the other side of the story is that the data isn't that positive that fish is really good for you. And that was a shock to me, because I thought, well, everyone knows fish is good for you. It's been drummed into me, for all of my life, and as a doctor and just as a kid, and as a parent as well, teaching my children, you've got to have this. It's good for your brain. You're going to fail your exams if you don't have fish. And of course, my son hated fish, and so it was always a struggle. But the studies show marginal improvements in longevity or health or heart disease in fish eaters versus non-fish eaters. So we're talking about sort of 5 to 8% improvements. So people expect it to be massively different. So that's within the margin of error. There's no evidence that eating fish is harmful for you in normal quantities, but I think the evidence that we must eat it to be healthy really isn't there. Anything like the evidence. It's been massively hyped. And there are other ways of getting your omega-3s through a whole wide range of plants, and also some high-quality, grass-fed meats as well. And so the idea that we should all be eating 2 or 3 portions of fish it doesn't hold up health-wise, but also we're going to kill off all the fish on the planet very soon if we follow that advice. And we've now lost something like 60% of our fish stocks in recent times, and most of the fish we eat is farmed. And to produce farm fish, you produce masses of environmental damage, and you have to kill off lots of other fish to feed those ones that then look nice on our plate. So I think we need to have a real new look at fish. And I think, yes, let's get high quality fish on the menu, but let's get the sustainable types. Let's stop treating this as a special, you can't touch fish. It's a wonderful food for the planet. It certainly isn't. And, seeing the horrors that in prawns and shrimps that come from these massive factories, aquaculture factories in Asia, and exported around the world really is bad. So we need to know much more about fish, and stop treating it with such reverence. But I still like fish in a restaurant. You can't beat a good fish, but let's pay extra for something that's sustainable and is really tasty and hasn't been fed other live fish just to make it look nice.
So you're not a fan of overdoing the fish, not a fan of supplements. So it's safe to assume you're not a fan of fish oil, which is the biggest supplement people are buying. Talk about if there's any benefit whatsoever of taking that.
For most people, there is no benefit. If you're on a really poor diet, I think, supplements do help people on very poor diets. And there's some evidence from the biggest trials that if you've just had a heart attack and you have a poor diet, then omega-3 supplements can actually help you. But for 95% of the population, they've shown in very large randomized trials that there's no difference to placebo. So if there is an effect, it is pretty tiny. And we are spending billions on omega-3 oils with massive promotions, and the data simply doesn't stack up. So again, this is my general attitude towards supplements. The more we talk about them, the more we diminish understanding real food and how we can get all these nutrients from other sources, from nuts and seeds and plants, in other ways other than from a bottle, and improve our general health. Every time everyone says, here's a quick cure for this, it means you're not educating someone about how else you should be getting that omega-3. And I think that's really important. So massively overhyped. I'm sorry. I'll upset lots of people who swear by it, and no evidence that it makes you or your kids brainier either.
So the data's out there. You're interpreting it, writing books, and breaking it down in a way people can understand. But why is this not being embraced by people as a whole and by governments and changing the way, restrictions are placed on societies and the way food is served in schools? Like, why is this not trickling to the right people and having an impact on society as a whole?
I think it's the same reason that we were smoking cigarettes for so long without any health warnings. And we look back and say, why didn't people not do anything in the 1960s or 70s about this? So we had 20 years we knew that these things were bad for us and we weren't going to change. It's, I think that 10 massive global food companies control 80% of all our food in the world. And they're bigger than countries. They're lobbying all the governments in the world to make sure that nothing really changes. The food supplement companies are now nearly as big as the food companies, and they're not the small little places that people think, little quaint, food supplements, they're not big government, they're not big pharma, they're little shops, little artisans make them. They're made in mega factories in China, with billion-dollar budgets to promote them. So you've got this huge marketing campaign. You also got lobbyists in governments everywhere making sure that people eat more ultra-processed food, and if necessary, you just add in omega-3s to the food. And so you got crap food, you add in this stuff, bit of vitamin D, bit of omega-3, bit of zinc, and your thiamine. And that is the model that the Western world is going for in a big way, because that's the commercial model. So until somebody breaks that, people aren't going to listen just to me. They're going to listen to all the adverts on billboards and buses and TV commercials that people like me can't compete with. But hopefully there's a ground up movement of people who really want to bring back real food, knowing that it's got everything we need in it.
And do you feel like with people like you putting that message out in the world, and with the internet these days where messages can spread and there's, no censorship technically, do you feel like things are changing in a better way, or are we still at ground zero with that?
No, I think we are changing. And I've noticed, in the last decade since I've been writing books on nutrition, definitely many more people are engaged, not only by my books, but more people are educated about it. There's podcasts, I'm being invited on more and more podcasts. There's more vehicles for me to spread the word, and people like me. I'm certainly not alone, and that's really important. And there seems to be a more general consensus, I think even 5 years ago, there was a lot of disparate ways. It's all gluten, it's all this, or it's all that. But I think things are converging, that we've got a major food crisis on our hands, and that the big evil, is becoming clearer that we need to tackle. And so I'm definitely more optimistic than I was 5 years ago that this ground roots movement can actually affect change, because if enough people on the ground don't buy their stuff in supermarkets, the supermarkets don't care. They'll sell anything. They'll change. And so the consumer does have the power and doesn't have to wait for governments to stop being corrupt and do something. So I think consumer power can change this. I've noticed in 5 years, I don't know what Canada is like, and maybe it's the US, but you can get kefir everywhere now, and the consumer has changed that. So suddenly fermented foods are everywhere in the UK, in any supermarket. And we have the power as consumers to change what is available for us. And we can say no to ultra-processed foods if we want to. But it's a big battle, because only people with sufficient funds and money can do that, because they are so cheap. And that's part of the problem.
What happens when you put out a book like this, Spoon-Fed? And I can assume you're not making a lot of friends, because on both ends of the spectrum, you're going against government policies, and then on the other hand, you're breaking these myths that a lot of people in the health and wellness space stand behind and believe in, things like supplements and fish oil and gluten, which we can get into. But there's so many different things that you're going uphill and against the grain on. So what happens when you put out a book like this?
Well, you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs. And I think that's really what I've learned here. But I'm at a stage of my life and my career that I feel I can say this. I've written over 900 scientific articles, so it's hard for me to criticize and say, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a scientist, or he's not a this. People try and say, well, he didn't train officially in nutrition, but usually this is from some nutritionist who's done 2 years study and written, one paper for their PhD. So it's, I'm in quite a unique position that I can speak without getting sacked from my university. I don't have government grants, so they can't control that. And I feel that there's enough people that support what I say. When I wrote, Diet Myth, I got so many emails and letters from saying, thank you, you've changed the way I think about food. Keep doing what you're doing. That the odd negative response didn't really worry me too much, because I realized that I'm not the guy who's going to be the diplomat for government, right? They're not going to ask me to do the report. But I do have problems with the worlds of nutrition, because a group of nutritionists are really too much embedded with the supplement world, and they often make their livings that way. And that's an unfortunate thing. That's very hard for them to get disconnected to that. So of all the things I say in my book, the ones that people disagree with most happens to be on the supplements. So mostly they agree with most things I say, but in a way, hopefully I'm even-handed about everyone's preconceptions. But I think what I want to do is just make people think again and not believe everything they've been taught, whether it's about meat, about fish, about veganism, about supplements. And I think, I'm in a lucky place. I can sort of speak my mind. And I've had relatively little flack compared to, I think, what I would have got 20 years ago. And that's partly because of my academic standing, as a full professor and medic and whatever. Quite hard to, really bring me down. Maybe that's it. Maybe I've just been lucky.
And to caveat the supplement piece, there are all different categories of supplements too. I'm not sure how you feel about it, but there's smaller companies that are making good supplements that are food-based and of high integrity. You mentioned the ones over in China. There's probably a ton more of the lower quality ones. But I'm curious, when it comes to something is being made, in the UK or the US, and it's a smaller company and it's made from real food, are you open to including any of those, or different green powders that have high nutrient profiles that can supplement a healthy diet. Is there any gray area there for you, or are you not into it?
No, I think, I say in my books, I've made mistakes and realized and changed my mind and moved on in many ways. So absolutely open to anything new science. And I think the one area, we've talked about probiotics, and, I'm not particularly keen on the ones at the moment, but I see the next generation as being very exciting, and in a way they're supplements. I also see the world of prebiotics. You sort of touched on it when you're talking about taking real foods and, sort of mashing them up. But if you took, say, 100 plants and you freeze dried them and made them very edible, and you put them into a powder, and you could tell me that those nutrients are the same, and you added that as a way of kickstarting your gut microbes, then I'd say that would be a very acceptable way. But I want to move away from this reductionism. The idea that, we've got at least 27,000 chemicals in food. And how many are there? 20, there are 20 common supplements. So we've picked 20 of the ones that, we've known about for the last 100 years or so. And we say, okay, let's focus on those. Forget all the other guys. And that's what I don't like, is this idea that we've got, that's why zinc is still used, and it still has, in most countries, you're allowed to say it helps the immune system. And those studies are complete rubbish. And why focus on zinc when you've got, in most fruits or, hundreds of other useful chemicals. So let's go to the whole plant, find ways of delivering the whole plant to people, whether you call it prebiotics or you call it, veggie mixes or whatever. Yes, very happy there. But let's not pretend we understand the science, and therefore we make up this pseudoscience to back up one single ingredient. The combinations of them, yeah, I think I'm going to have an open mind on those ones. And we now have the ability to actually test it. I think that's one thing I'm going to be doing in the next few years is actually doing some community testing. So we've got, as I said, 30,000 people have done the Zoe personal nutrition study. We can get them to take some of these supplements and retest their gut microbes. We've got 500,000 people on the Zoe health study, which was based around COVID. And we're hoping to do big dietary interventions on them to see how they feel. You get 50,000 people to take, omega-3, and 50,000 take some other dummy for a month and see how they feel. We can actually do this, but also moving towards this new goal. So I'll always keep an open mind, but I want us not to be reductionist. And I think we have to realize how little we know. And if we ignore all those chemicals in whole foods, we're really dumbing it all down.
One more controversial topic I want to hit on before we part ways, and that's gluten. Because this seems to be, if anything, picking up more steam in the health and wellness space. More and more people are adopting a gluten-free diet, saying that they're sensitive to gluten. What is the science saying?
Well, the science says that 1% of people definitely have a gluten problem. They have celiac disease, and there are tests for them. The problem is the other 9% of the population that think they have a gluten problem, when it turns out, when you actually test them with gluten, most of them don't. So what I think people need to realize is that self-testing is really quite difficult unless you're going to get someone to fool you and double blind you and give you gluten-free pasta one day and not the other, and do this in a really systematic way. People are fooled by it. And once you feel you've got a gluten problem, in a way you have it. And a lot of it, I think, is due to eating really bad breads, chemical breads that are not made the traditional way with sourdough, but are made chemically, that might cause bloating through to other parts of that process, not just the gluten. And often eating sandwiches that are very bad for you because of other things in it. Generally, it's a sign that you have a poor gut microbiome and you're eating generally poor foods. I think it's when you speak to a lot of nutritionists who deal with it, with people with these problems clinically. So I think people need to reassess this obsession with gluten, because the alternatives tend to be less healthy than eating gluten itself, because you end up with more ultra-processed replacements, which the food industry loves. So again, you're falling into the trap of paying 3 times more for your food. I'd say go to these people, go back, look at your whole diet, consult a nutritionist properly, and try, if you are going to go back to bread, make sure, you get something that's homemade, sourdough, long fermented, and the vast majority of people will not have problems.
We focus a lot on the microbiome here and how to build a healthy microbiome. But what are some of the things in our environment that people are commonly using or doing that are destroying that microbiome?
Well, the first thing is most people are taking antibiotics. Very hard to avoid antibiotics, and we certainly do need them. Usually at some point in our life, there'll be a point where we were glad we took antibiotics, may have saved our life or stopped a major infection. But we probably overuse them about threefold. So, often treat viruses with antibiotics, which are completely ineffectual and just damage your gut microbes. So just questioning whether you need antibiotics or you should wait a bit longer, I think is important. There's obviously ultra-processed foods is the other probably big source of damage to your gut microbiome. Not only do they rarely have any fiber in them, because most of the food you have that's ultra-processed is absorbed early up in the gut and gets into the bloodstream very fast. None of the fiber gets to the colon and the microbes, so they're sort of effectively being starved. And then there's lots of other chemicals in ultra-processed foods and drinks that we now know disrupt the gut microbes, such as artificial sweeteners, emulsifiers, gums, certain preservatives, etc. So that's that whole other category of foods that we don't know precisely how they affect the gut microbes, but we know they give off abnormal signals when you test people giving those specific ones. And it could be that some people, there's an individuality to it. So there's some new data showing that some people particularly will respond badly to certain emulsifiers, like carrageenan, for example, and certain people, but not others, might respond badly to saccharin and sucralose. So they have a metabolic reaction to these things as well as a gut microbiome reaction. And I guess the third category is through the use of herbicides and pesticides. And this is a new area that hasn't really been studied. Aren't large-scale studies. They're very expensive to do. And as you can imagine, the industry isn't very keen to highlight it. We're so dependent on things like glyphosate and Roundup. But what I did find is, that there's huge differences in if you're a big strawberry lover, or you like your oat porridge, you're going to be eating 5 times more herbicides than anyone else, because there's 5 times more in those foods than the other foods you eat. So it pays to know where these things are coming from, and there's increasing evidence that these herbicides don't attack human cells or genes at all, because they've been well studied for that, but they do affect your gut microbes that aren't protected, and they change, and then your community will then produce abnormal chemicals as a result. And it's still theoretical, there's no hard proof of this, but it could be one reason that there are these examples of people with high exposures getting certain rare cancers, etc. So, we don't know the full story yet, but certainly there's room for concern if you're a vegetarian eating lots of plants that are sprayed regularly with herbicides and pesticides, or you are pregnant, or you've got young children eating a lot of these things, particularly lots of oats and berries, etc., that do get sprayed this way. So I think these are they're some of the common things that people often don't think about that can affect the gut microbiome that aren't related directly to food. But also living just in a city will impair your gut microbiome compared to being in the country.
How so?
Well, we don't really know, but just being close to nature, soil, all the microbes in animals, plants. I think cities are more sterile places. And so generally people who live in the countryside do have more diverse gut microbes than people in cities. And you should always get a smelly dog and kiss a smelly dog if you want to improve your gut microbes.
Coming back to that herbicide pesticide piece, Tim, are you somebody that when you can, you buy organic?
Yes. I'm not obsessional about it, but my regular fruits and vegetables, I do get organic. Because I've realized that in the last 10 years, as I've gone more plant-based, certainly I'm actually exposing myself more, ironically, to these chemicals than I was perhaps when I was eating more meats and just potatoes and things. So, yes, I try and do that, and I now, will wash them off more than I used to, and luckily I've given up things like oats, but that would have been a worry if I was on a regular oat breakfast. And breakfast cereals have a lot of these and they tend to be higher levels also in North America than in Europe. The levels permitted are greater. So it's perhaps another reason that, we should be switching to more organic plant. And the more people do it, the prices will then come down. So it's a sort of catch-22.
And pesticides aside, have you looked at any of the research that looks at, from a nutritional perspective, the difference of food that's organic versus conventional?
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that there's more omega-3 in organic meat, beef, than non-organic. There's some evidence that there are higher polyphenol counts in non-pesticide treated plants, which sort of makes sense in a way because they have to defend themselves. Therefore, they're tougher. And so if you're just spraying them all the time, they get a bit lazy and said, who needs defense chemicals when I've got, all that Roundup sprayed on me, and the soil is completely sterile, So there's that. And then there's been some epidemiology studies showing that in France, people who had regular organic foods did have less heart disease and cancers, although it's an observational study, so it's not by far definitive. But I think the evidence is building that really wasn't there a few years ago. So we are getting more and more evidence to support that it is worthwhile.
I'm glad you highlighted, Tim, there, the fact that these polyphenols are actually part of the defense mechanism of plants. And when they, have a harsher life, those are actually going to accumulate more within the plant.
Yes, and I think we're going to be hearing more of this sort of stuff as polyphenols start to get highlighted, as this becomes more general knowledge, because the food manufacturers can now manipulate some foods and plants to produce more polyphenols. And I was speaking to some food producer who makes organic foods in rather artificial scenarios, and they've worked out that just by putting a lot of wind into one of these tunnels, they get like 30% more polyphenol growth in those plants, because they feel that they need more defenses. So I think in the future we can actually manipulate some of these foods to be healthier for us and move away from the iceberg lettuce, which clearly didn't have any foes at all, didn't need any polyphenols, to ones that are really, ready for a fight, and they're the ones. And it sort of explains it as well, why there's more polyphenols at the tips of plants, and on the outside leaves of plants and in the sprouts, all these places that, there's a lot of growth but it's a lot of danger. That's where all the good stuff is. And in a way, we've probably gone the other way. We always get rid of that stuff and go for the boring bits in the middle, So need to change our whole mindset, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, that is. And it's interesting to think of, this coevolution of plants and humans, and basically we're taking their defense mechanism and using that synergistically with our own biology to make ourselves healthier. It's just fascinating to think of it that way.
Yeah, it is. And of course, plants were around before humans. They've been interacting with other animals, but of course, plants are interacting all the time with microbes in the soil. And that's how they've evolved, as sort of co-evolved systems where they're swapping nutrients and chemicals with those microbes in the soil. So we've come to the party late, really, but we're just finding out. But it just sort of shows that once you start to mess with the soil with all these fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides, you disrupt this normal link between the plants and the microbes that have been around for millions of years.
I know you're not a fan of different diet labels, whether it be vegan, keto, carnivore, which is what I want to get into now, because it counters a lot of what we've been talking about today. So carnivore diet's going to essentially have no fiber to feed the gut microbiome. So I'm curious, because there is this momentum within that paradigm, at least in the online space, people talking about how it's been a diet that's helped them, at least in the short term, improve their health. How do you think about that?
Well, I can see why it helps people short term. Often it means they are eating whole foods, cutting out junk foods, cutting out a lot of these chemicals and things that are harmful to them, reduces some of their appetite cravings, etc., etc. It's a sort of reductionist diet that's cutting out a lot of junk food. But where it might be a good way to get started, have a clean break, it is, in my view, absolutely, for 99% of people, not sustainable and not good long-term for their health, because it will rapidly diminish the quality of the gut microbiome, and it can be very difficult to recover from it. So I think it's misguided as a long-term way of life. I think it's fine as a short-term fix, just like keto diets. But I don't think they're easily sustainable, both for most people from a practicality point of view, but also as a long-term health point of view. And I think, what I'd like is, yes, I'm quite happy for people to eat meat as long as they can still get a diversity of plants. And I think there ought to be ways of, being more flexible within these diets to say, okay, I still like to have my meat. I'm not going to have starchy vegetables. Okay. So you cut out your potatoes, your rice, your pasta. That's fine. But I'm going to still get my variety of plants to keep my gut microbes happy. And, try that. But, don't be so rigid that you're going to, let dogma mess up your immune system and your gut health. I'm not saying there aren't some people on the planet that don't do well on this. We know that, Eskimos and Maasai and whatever can live, have genetically evolved to live on very different diets, can do so. But I think for the majority of us, that's going to be pretty tough.
Well, that's a big part of your message as a whole, the fact that we are all different and we need to look at what's going to work for us in our biology, which might not work for our neighbor.
Yeah, that's why, I'm not dismissing everybody. There aren't some people in the world that can't do very well on a predominantly meat diet, or, why doesn't find there are billions of people who are, total vegans. We are omnivores. We're flexible. We've evolved to live in different parts of the world. But I think to optimize our health, most of us need to think of this extra organ in our body, which is the gut microbiome. And if it's a bit like saying, well, I don't mind eating, but I'm not interested in my liver or my heart. They can do what they like. You do need them. And so we need to think the same about our microbes.
Up until this point, Tim, we've talked about the gut microbiome. But as somebody that is so fascinated by that and does research in this area, how do you think about the microbiome of our skin? Is that something you consider?
Yes. Well, my wife's a dermatologist, so we often discuss skin microbiome. And it is very important. They interestingly, we did a study on the genetics of body odor in our twins. And I researched body odor, and it turns out that it's all the composition of the microbes on the skin that produce different chemicals that produce our unique body odors. So they are important for our individuality. And again, in our skin, we are all very different. So that's why we all do smell different. That's why babies can always smell their mother. That's why all animals have this unique ability to separate humans. It's our individuality. And that's why a lot of skin diseases occur in some people and not others, is partly because of our different skin microbiome. And, in some ways it protects us, and others it can be a problem. And a lot of eczema and skin dermatitis is related to the skin microbiome. Often overwashing and overusing soap and over hygiene has been a major problem, particularly in kids, in mothers overdoing it and making the whole problem worse. Often the microbiome is there to protect you and protect against disease. And overwashing has been a major cause of problems in recent years in the West.
Well, this kind of ties back with what you just said. Plus, before when we talked about things in the environment that could affect the microbiome of the gut, this applies to both that and the skin. Are you somebody who's an advocate for using more natural products when it comes to cleaning the home, cleaning the skin? Do you think there's any validity in these?
Yeah, I mean, my wife, for example, says no one should ever use soap on their face. And yet, the amount of products many people use on their face to cleanse their face, which are highly artificial, is enormous. Putting chemicals on there, blocking the pores, getting rid of all those healthy microbes, massively overdoing it. And also most women use skin creams that contain UPFs that protect against sunshine, and they use them all year round. So the skin and the microbes are not getting sunshine, they're not getting vitamin D. I think we've gone far too far the wrong way, and we need to get back to much more natural methods, certainly. So that's the extent of my knowledge. It's rather broad brush, but I think it does resonate in that there are definite parallels between how we treat our microbes in different parts of our body, and they are everywhere as well. And the same goes for there's lots of studies about vaginal microbes and people over hygiene air there that causes all kinds of problems and can cause infertility and things. So sometimes we just leave things naturally.
And I'd have to assume too, using a lot of these chemical products to clean, our bathrooms, our homes, they would have to impact the gut microbiome too, and not just the skin.
Yeah, I don't think there's much data on that, but it's pretty obvious that if you're using bleaches and Dettol and things like this, that they're going to be harmful. There is some data of people who regularly use mouthwashes, chemical mouthwashes, have much poorer quality pro-inflammatory gut oral microbes, and ultimately cause more problems of bad breath and things than people who don't use them. So again, you get a short-term benefit, you cleanse, you get rid of all your gut microbes, your breath might feel better for a couple of hours, but long-term, actually, you're doing them great damage.
And Tim, where along your health journey did you become fascinated with the microbiome? And I'm curious, what was the catalyst for that?
It started about 13 years ago when I've been studying twins for 30 years. So my day job, if you like, is looking after the UK's biggest twin registry of 15,000 twins that I've been studying for 30 years. And I was always interested in why twins were so similar, got the same habits, the same smile, picking up a beer the same way, and finding genes for all kinds of things, which I did for about 15 years. But then at that point, I started looking to say, why are identical twins often so different? One gets cancer, the other one doesn't. One gets rheumatoid arthritis, the other one doesn't. One is happy or depressed, one's thin, one's overweight. And these are, genetic clones. They've lived the same life for 18 years. It's like, they shouldn't be different. If you can find why they're different, then you can crack all kinds of medical mysteries. So I first look at something called epigenetics, which is how you can switch genes on and off, and really got into that, but realized that those effects were really quite small. They existed, so in theory it was right, but they just didn't explain these really massive differences. And at that point, I went at a genetics conference, heard a talk about the microbiome from a guy called Marty Blazer, who was looking at ulcers. And it was this whole idea of eradicating duodenal ulcers, which are caused by this bug. And it was an interesting talk because he said, once you eradicate the bug that's causing the ulcers, you actually get other problems. You actually get other cancers, and it causes other problems further down the line because of this intensive antibiotic treatment, and that we should be wary about, just killing all the bugs. And that's when really I got, this is interesting, this microbiome. So then I got together with Ruth Lay and Cornell, and we did the first big twin study of the microbiome to see how did genes really influence the microbes or not. And it turned out that, just as I suspected, identical twins actually had rather very different microbes. And so that was the aha moment for me. Said, okay, really different. Not just epigenetics was a little bit different, but these were so different. They were hardly different, any more similar than you or I. And that just was said, that's great. And that was great for two reasons. It could explain all these differences in how we respond to foods and our health, all these mysteries about why one person gets a disease, the other one doesn't. And our whole relationship with food suddenly came into play. And I think it also had a really good, unlike genetics, which I had been doing for 20 years, I think it had a really good feel because it was motivational, because you can change your gut microbes. You can't change your parents. And I think that was really important, empowering for everyone, that we can all eat healthily, improve our gut microbes, change our lifestyles. We can do this and therefore influence our own health without needing, surgical intervention or medicines.
When it comes to these twins and they're identical and their microbiome is so different, I'm curious why that is. I mean, I can see if one of them picked up and moved to the other side of the world and was in a different environment, eating different foods. But for the ones that, were living in the same area and living a similar lifestyle, why the difference?
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, that, and I think what it shows is that the early life, our first 4 years of life, are possibly the most important, and we sort of forget about it. But in those first 4 years, obviously we start life with 0 microbes and essentially sterile. And the birth process, we get them from the messiness of the birth canal and what's going on there, all the blood and poo and everything, and all the secretions. And it's very random what happens and falls into the baby's mouth. And even with twins, if a different nurse picked them up, those microbes would go from that nurse, the skin, onto the baby. Which baby had an infection first, which was typically breastfeeding before the other or longer, would have an effect. And all kinds of illnesses have big effects on these growing infants. So that's how they seem to be developing different microbes. It's a lot of randomness, which must be there for a reason, to give us evolutionary reason that it's evolved. It wasn't so strict. Obviously, every baby gets microbes so they can digest breast milk, but all the extra ones are really not very programmed and seem to be rather random. And I think that's really fascinating to me. But it may be that we're more different now because we're exposed to things like antibiotics as children much more than ever before. But even just common viruses have massive effects and on kids. Having different friends at school, they'll be swapping microbes, going to a friend's house and licking the dog, all of these things, playing in the garden. We don't know, but yeah, we're much more different than we would imagine.
In your book, you talk about going to Africa and visiting the Hadza tribe. And I'm curious, when you went to do that, were you looking at the microbiome of those people at all?
We were. So we're working with a group of us. We're working on the gut microbiome and produced some papers on this because they've been studied before I'd got there. And we knew from some of the work there that they had this very rich microbiome. And we also did some, they have twice as many microbes as we do and very different profiles. So it looks like we've lost the ones that they still have. And it was very interesting to look at the differences between the Western societies and those ones. And generally, they just had super healthy gut microbes that we were all very jealous of. And we also did some other testing there, looking at their biological ages, and showed generally that they didn't often know their ages, but when we were guessing what their ages were, their biological age was really doing pretty well. And we found that there's a pretty good correlation between biological age and your microbiome. So it was, we were doing those tests, and I was actually testing my own microbes as I was living with them for several days, eating their food, going off walking, hunting with them, and with no 5-star showers at the end of the day. It was interesting. I did manage to increase my microbial diversity by about 30% in that short while I was there, but it was short-lived. As soon as I got back on the plane and ate that airplane food, I think it regressed back by the time I got to London. But it was an interesting journey to see how, with their variety and their lifestyle, maybe not just the food they're eating, but also surrounded by the dirt and the animals, and being in the open air all the time in a non-sterile environment was obviously very helpful to our ancestors.
Talk more about what a typical day would look like. What time would you get up, and take us through what a day looked like?
Well, it's equatorial Africa, so it was, it's sort of 6:30 in the morning till 6:30 at night, dawn and dusk. And you generally slept in a little bit until it got too hot. So you get up about 7:30 and walk around and chat. And interesting, there was none of the Hadza were interested in the concept of breakfast. They would just maybe get out to the river or something and splash their faces and get ready and start very, very slowly working up. And we asked them, I said, where's breakfast? They didn't have a word for breakfast. So it was, so we want breakfast, well, just, grab some berries. And at about 10 or 11, women did actually get some baobabs, which were lying all over the place, and crunched them into a porridge, which was like a delicious drink full of fiber. So they tended to have that about 11 o'clock. And then, women and men would separate, they have very different lives. Men do. We were at a time when it was the dry season, so actually it was quite easy to get game because they all went to the same waterhole, and it was very easy to kill the game. So they didn't have a problem with meat at that time. There was plenty of it. And so they were all feeling very comfortable. And the women would collect tubers. So they'd just go out, tap a bit on the ground, and with a pointy stick, just dig up these amazing tubers, a bit like sweet potatoes or yams, and then spend the next 3 hours chatting with their kids, roasting these things on the fire. And some of the men would go out and pick berries off trees, just they wanted to walk. And they were really abundant. And these are really tiny little berries, very quite sour without the sweetness, but they had a great flavour to them, and big variety. You come up with 5 different types in your hand, and just it's like a giant supermarket. This place, and you'd find these kids coming back with little birds and things that they'd kill with bows and arrows. It was I was shocked how easy it was to get food. I mean, I think that's the one thing that surprised me totally. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be doing 20 kilometer fast walks every day just to get one tiny squirrel or something, and I would be ecstatic. But no, it was easier, and they're also into their honey. And so when someone finds honey, the whole tribe drop everything, whatever they're doing. Even hunting, they're just about to get some big game. They go and they go to the tree where they found the honey, and the whole group of 50 people are there helping and sharing that honey. So it was, yes, my impression was of sort of abundant food, very relaxed idea, no concept of breakfast, ultimate sharing. Everything got shared out in a very sociable, amenable way. No one ate first. And so it was, that was very much this social bond was all around food and about the fire and the barbecue. Everything was barbecued. There was no microwaves or even much in the way of kitchen utensils. It was you had a knife, you skinned whatever it was, stuck it on the barbecue, had it with the yams, and that's what they liked to. And they sat around chatting for hours. Then they'd go to when it was dark, wait till the embers of the fire went out, and generally they rolled up a blanket and either slept by the fire or in small huts, and they slept really well for 7.5 hours, and they had a pretty good life. And that's the life of our ancestors, really, and not an overweight one amongst them, and they all look pretty fit, because by the time they've got there, a lot of the kids, it's the kids who die off, but if they make it to adulthood, they're super fit and healthy, and they'll live without diabetes, cancer, allergies, autoimmune diseases, all this kind of stuff. So it was very privileged to have seen that.
That must have been such a life-changing experience. How long ago was that, Tim?
It was about 5 years ago, I think. It was quite remarkable, and I remember going with a very seasoned BBC journalist, Dan Saladino, and for him it was very much a life-changing moment. And he'd been around the world, covering food stories, but it's like you're just watching your past. It's like having a time machine in a way.
And are they pretty welcoming to Westerners coming over and visiting?
They are. I mean, they're quite shy, but they're used to researchers doing this. They don't really understand it, but as long as they're trading something, they're super friendly, and they're not aggressive. So they know that the foreigners are sort of keeping their land safe for them against the pastoralists who just want to cut down all the trees and graze their cattle. So they were really cool. I mean, but there's only a few thousand left.
You talked about a natural part of their lifestyle was not eating breakfast till just before noon. Are you somebody that embraces intermittent fasting, or have you since that experience?
Yeah, in the last 5 years, I have changed my views on this. I've always been keen on experimenting myself, and when what we used to call intermittent fasting, which I think is a bit complicated. The term 5-2 is what I used to call it. So reducing your calories for 5 days out of 7, and then eating as much as you like the next day. That was, I think, the old term of intermittent fasting. Now, I've given this breakfast idea, and having studied the literature to show that despite most websites in government places around the world saying it's dangerous to skip breakfast, which was the dogma when I was brought up and at medical school, realized that actually that the data doesn't support that anymore. There's no real danger in skipping breakfast, and there are likely some benefits, metabolic and weight-wise, for some people, not everybody. So that it should be something people should try. But I've got more interested in the last 5 years about this time-restricted eating, and which is extending the overnight fast, which is pretty much what the Hadza do. So they would stop eating, I would say, by about 8 or 9 o'clock. They'll have their last munch of cold meat for the barbecue, and they wouldn't be eating anything else or drinking until about 11 the next morning. So they'd be naturally having a 14-hour overnight fast, which the current science is now supporting as the sort of optimal, practical way of doing this that actually rests your gut microbes, improves your metabolic health, and can lead to reduced sugar dips and potentially help you control weight better. So just by controlling how you eat rather than what you eat. And that's I think, where I think the science is going, and that's what I now practice. So I'm not saying I'm fastidious about it, but when it's relatively easy, I will either skip breakfast or delay it until after 11 or midday. And I found I feel much better on that. And I just feel more sharp and alert because I'm not someone who feels super hungry when they wake up. But I do embrace the idea that we're all unique and that some people do, and some people prefer, getting an early breakfast, early lunch, early dinner, and then nothing to eat afterwards. I find that really hard. But I think let's listen to our bodies more and listen less to dogma often driven by the food industry, telling us we must have our cornflakes and, our Frosties, and this is the healthy breakfast, and that your kids will suffer dreadful things at school if you don't do that. A lot of kids know when to eat, and I think we're doing a lot of harm by sort of forcing particularly these high-carb foods on people early in the morning.
Talk more about that piece of giving the gut microbiome a rest, because this is a piece that when people are talking about intermittent fasting, they don't often get into, or at least not the nuances. So obviously we're not providing food for ourselves, our system, and you mentioned how that can be metabolically healthy, at least for some people. But let's talk about what happens to the gut microbiome in the short term, and then again in the longer term.
So short term, what happens when you stop eating is that because you've got to realize that your microbiome is living at super speed. So, they're having sex and reproducing and having families, every hour, sometimes up to every half an hour. So they're responding very fast to the environment. And we stop eating, and the microbes that would normally be munching on our food or a sandwich or whatever, they're not reproducing anymore. They're not doing anything. So the group that normally, and so they're outcompeted during that time by other microbes that actually like the scraps. They like eating the bits of sugars stuck in our mucus lining of our gut that has grown over that day. And so they're like grazing on this grass in our intestines, which is from our own bodies. So they're carnivores, if you like, eating our own bodies, but it's in a nice way. They've evolved with us to keep our gut lining nice and tidy. And there are particular microbes. There's one well-known one called Akkermansia. You only see it sort of coming out in big numbers at night. And it's a good guy because by nibbling at our mucus layer, it stops it getting leaky. So that's the short-term benefit of this. And we know that if you stop that happening, then your mucus, your gut layer becomes less efficient and all kinds of things, and it can get inflamed. Now, if you overdo it, and the studies have shown, particularly in mice, going for like a week of fasting, they overeat right through to the good bit. So you've got to be a bit careful that you don't overdo the fasting. And long term, what we believe is these changes, which are really fitting into our sort of, in a way, ancient circadian rhythms, are beneficial for producing the right chemical signals from the microbes back to our body. So the studies are now showing that people who do this properly, this 12 to 16 hour fasting period gives a better metabolic health, reduces our sugar peaks when we eat foods, our fat peaks, and can also lead to some weight loss. So this is a really exciting research, which is suddenly linking up some of these ideas about how fasting was good for you with our microbes, but in a way that doesn't actually alter the food you're eating, like the old-fashioned 5-2 intermittent fasting, but actually you can eat normally, but just in a different time frame that suits you, either very early in the day or very late in the day.
Let's stick with that diversity piece and talk about the 30 different plants in a week, because I think this is a great goal for people. It's going to get them, hopefully, when they're doing their grocery shopping, checking out different things and figuring out different recipes to include these. But why is the diversity so important? Let's take that right into the gut, getting these different plants to the microbiome. Why is that important?
Okay, so the 30 plant rule came from a study that I did with Rob Knight's team in San Diego about 5 or 6 years ago, where we looked at 11,000 Brits and American guts and correlated the diversity and health of their gut microbiome with things in their diet. And what we turned out that the number one factor that correlated with the best gut health was not whether they were vegan, it wasn't whether they were gluten-free, vegetarian, pescatarian, whatever. It was just the number of different plants they ate over a week. And that's what really sort of changed our minds about this. This was a pretty good mantra for people to take, that you could come at it from lots of different directions. It, didn't specify which type of plant they were. And people forget what plants are. Plants are not just your kale and broccoli and spinach, but they are also the average seed, which is incredibly nutritious. It's a nut, and different nuts count as different plants. It can be, I now think of coffee as a plant. I didn't before. This is, my research into coffee, how amazingly good it is. And it's actually a source of fiber a major source of fiber for most Americans, for example. Dark chocolate is made from a bean that is a plant. So if you take that more liberal view of plants, it's quite easy to get your 30 a week. And if you have to think of a plant is made up of lots of different fibers and chemicals, and the key part is it's a whole plant, so it goes beyond your stomach and your small intestine and goes right down to the colon, where it can be met by your microbes, and they start to digest it with their enzymes. They break it apart, they get the nutrients, and they're stimulated by other things in the plants called polyphenols, which they use as energy. And in return, they produce all these healthy chemicals that are key for our metabolism, our immune system, regulating our brain, our mood, all kinds of other stuff. So it's that link of getting the right foods to the right place. And the reason they have to be different is that they're so highly specialized that you have a different set of microbes that's going to be attacking your purple carrot and your orange carrot, because the chemicals in those two plants are different. And so it'd be a whole different team of microbes working on them. And if you give them different foods, you'll be able to grow up different microbes. That's the theory of what we're trying to do here, and why it's important not to do, the old English way of eating. Well, a bit of meat and 2 veg was and one of the veg was potatoes. It would either be carrots or peas. That's all, that was the, seen as a healthy meal. But now it's very much, it'd be meat and 5 veg, should be the new sort of mantra. And so if you try and get variety, you're not going to get too much of anything. So if you're every meal you're thinking about getting that diversity in there, you don't tend to overeat on any of the starchy carbs that people worry about. Quite rightly, because if you just ate mashed potato all the time or fluffy rice, you're getting huge sugar spikes, and for many people, not everybody, that can be unhealthy. But it doesn't mean you can't then have a small amount of rice, as long as you've got lots of other plants on that plate as well.
So just to make sure I have this right, you talked about how plants have these polyphenols. Diversity is important. Does science know yet why that diversity is so important? It's not just a fiber thing, getting a certain amount of fiber, whether it be soluble, insoluble. What I'm getting at here, do we understand the different chemicals in the different plants that highlights the importance of the diversity? Is it polyphenols, or is it stuff that science hasn't discovered yet?
Well, it's undoubtedly a bit of the latter, but it's certainly a lot of it is polyphenols. But we still know very little about polyphenols. There are thousands of them, and many of them we don't know their functions, or we can measure their total amounts, but we don't know all the individual ones that go on. And there's a huge variety of in polyphenol counts in foods, and this is one thing I go into in the book in a lot of detail, is trying to work out within a range, say lettuces, salads. You can have a 2,000-fold difference between the amount of healthy polyphenols in that plant, so that you'd have to eat 1,000 times more iceberg lettuces, for example, than a nice Lolo Rosso Italian lettuce with those purple tips, because there's virtually no nutrients in an iceberg lettuce, and there's masses in that other one, which you can sort of look and see with your eyes, the pigment, and you can taste that slight peppery bitterness too, that gives you the clues. So I think it's really interesting to try and link what we can do with our eyes and our mouth to, and we can choose foods and link that to the chemistry underneath. So that when you're having those two different foods, one, you're getting no polyphenols and very little fiber and just a dressing for the mayonnaise or whatever. But it does last, 3 weeks at the bottom of your fridge. And the other one, which goes off, and you've got all these defense chemicals, and you've got the fiber, and it's having a really major effect on your body and producing, keeping lots of microbes alive. So that's why I want people to learn more about food and get excited about the different types that we're seeing, and not just be sort of spoon-fed whatever, food companies or hotels want to feed us, which generally tends to be the stuff that never goes off, that has no taste, that has no polyphenols, that is rotten. Like the ubiquitous breakfast bar in Canada and the US, the green melon, it's the most thrown away item, I think, in North America. And
honeydew?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Because, they're bred for just lasting a long time, looking good, having no taste and virtually no nutrients.
A few years ago, the big talk, or one of the big talks in the health space, was antioxidants. And I know antioxidants somehow tie into this polyphenol thing. Is polyphenols a type of antioxidant? Or are they just renaming antioxidants now to polyphenols, or how do those fit together?
Well, antioxidants was a general term for things that they knew were beneficial, but they didn't quite know how they worked. And there was this general theory that these were sort of nutritious chemicals that somehow mopped up dangerous excess chemicals in the cells and the reactions. And we now know that a large number of those antioxidants are actually polyphenols, and they don't work directly on the body. They have to work via the gut microbes, who then produce chemicals that then help the body. So we're slowly discovering that we didn't really know what antioxidants were. We just knew there were some generally healthy chemicals in foods, and working out now more the mechanisms of how they work. So we're still sorting this out, and there are still a few antioxidants that aren't polyphenols or don't come into that general category. But most of them, I think, are in these polyphenols or group of phenolic compounds that we're increasingly seeing. But it's slightly confusing as we make this transition. But I think most people, when they talked about antioxidant, didn't really understand what it meant. It is a vague scientific term, and it sort of served a purpose for a while, but I think we can generally ignore it now.
Yeah, it was always very general. We want more antioxidants, and they're going to help mop up free radicals in the body. That was the big thing.
Yeah, and I think that was also the time when we were talking about purging the body of toxins and cleansing and all this mumbo jumbo that we now know is complete nonsense. That and actually it's just the repair process that happens every day in our cells. And so I think we're growing up slowly, but it's taken a while because we just haven't had the science behind it to really understand, and the gut microbes are unlocking a lot of this science to tell us, how they convert something in food to an active compound that can affect the body.
Tim, I know last time we chatted, we got into polyphenols and how they end up reacting with the gut microbiome and what they do, but I want to make sure I'm really clear on this. Let's continue the story here. So polyphenols, we want to get lots of them. We want to get them, there's a bunch of different ones, so we want a diverse array. What happens when they get down to the gut microbiome? You mentioned that the gut makes chemicals out of them. Is this postbiotics, or what are these chemicals?
Yes, so they act as energy for the gut microbes. So particular gut microbes will be sent, they can smell out the different types of plant you're eating, they'll zoom in on it, and they'll start burrowing away in order to get the little nuggets of polyphenols that they can then use for energy and then replicate and get, have more babies and grow their colony, and then in turn produce their own chemicals. And the chemicals that microbes produce, as you rightly said, are called postbiotics. And these postbiotic chemicals, it's a sort of new term, but it's a bit like probiotics, but made by the microbes. And we know that they actually make a large number of things that we thought were only made by the liver. So they can replicate a lot of things that the human body makes, but also make a lot of products that humans can't make. And what's called a postbiotic is when we believe it has some health benefit, because we haven't classified every chemical they make, because a lot of them are just to help themselves or communicate directly with the immune system or the nervous system or the brain or whatever. But ones that seem to have a direct health benefit are these postbiotics. And so this is a whole new area of therapy, because people are thinking about growing up vast vats of bacteria that can produce these really healthy chemicals as a new form of supplementation, for example, without having to eat the food and have the gut microbes. So there's an enormous amount of interest that these are sort of naturally occurring chemicals in our body must be safe by definition, because they're in us, and how do we make more of them?
Let's talk about short-chain fatty acids and how they fit into this whole big picture.
So they're one of the classical postbiotics, and they are made when particular microbes are fermenting plants. So you can't get them from, they don't actually come from fats, interestingly. So they come from when a microbe is having some fiber-rich foods. It's a fiber-digesting microbe, and it picks up whatever energy it needs from the polyphenols of that plant, and then it will produce these short-chain fatty acids. And the commonest one of those is butyrate, and it's believed to be a really beneficial postbiotic that has benefits particularly on our immune cells and regulating the immune system, and dampens down inflammation and is generally healthy. What's interesting is that when they've given butyrate in clinical trials to people, you get rather sporadic results. So it shows that it's not as easy just to transfer what the microbes do in a natural environment, and you can't suddenly make it into a pill and it's a game changer. So, and it could be because there's a ratio of that particular product compared to other ones, other short-chain fatty acids that's important, or it could be other things we're still ignorant about. But that's one of the big things about why we believe that eating fiber is important. Nothing to do with cleansing our digestive tract or repairing or having fast transit times. It's the fact that this allows all these short-chain fatty acids to be produced, which we know that is generally healthy. People who have high levels of these short-chain fatty acids naturally are much healthier and tend to be thinner and have less diseases. So it's increasingly being used as a marker of good health.
And do we specifically know what the short-chain fatty acids are doing in the body, where they're going, and why they're so important?
We know a little bit, but we certainly don't have the full picture. We maybe know 10% of what's going on with them. They are quite hard to measure, and it's hard to trace them entirely. And that's why most of the work has been going on their interactions with T cells in the lining of the gut, the immune cells. So they're really important in suppressing food allergies and things like that, or the immune cells overreacting. They may have a role in aging and repair. There's lots of potential reasons, but it seems to be a tight control of the immune system, and so it doesn't overreact, doesn't underreact, but it does fight infection, etc., and it is useful for repair and picking up early cancers and these things. So it probably has a widespread role all across the body rather than one specific one that we can home in on, and that's maybe why just giving people vast doses of butyrate, which I think it was used in stink bombs and various other things, and it's produced in rotting fish and things in large amounts. So it's a strange compound to think of as super healthy. But
talk more about that connection between the immune system and the gut. We know a big part of the immune system is down there surrounding, our gut, and it's very well integrated with the microbiome down there. So we know we've been talking about, building up a healthy gut microbiome, how important this is, but let's go deeper into why, from an immune standpoint, this is so important.
Most of our immune cells are actually in the lining of our gut. So no one really understood why that was for a long time. People thought it was just a defensive barrier to combat what was going on, but increasingly it seems to be that it's for communication rather than as a defense. So all the way along the gut, the immune cells are receiving nutrients from the gut. So that's as food is being digested, bits of it are going to feed the immune cells on the gut wall, but they're also getting these chemical signals from the microbes, telling them about the food that's being eaten and stimulating them to, as I said, to react or underreact, as a way of making sure that the immune system is working well. It may be also to do with whether it's feeding time or fasting time. about whether it can relax, because we have a circadian rhythms for this, and it's not just about daylight. The gut is a really important driver of whether our body's in sort of action mode or it's in rest mode. And so all these signals have been passed to the immune cells, and then they pass this on through the body, or, to the rest of the body to say, let's rest and repair, or, let's get ready to fight, guys, and not to overreact or underreact. And so that's why many people think that because of the deterioration in our diet in the last 30 years, we've, got the wrong signals from our gut microbes. That's upset our immune cells. And we have this epidemics of food allergies, for example, that just didn't exist 40 years ago, because the immune cells are overreacting because they're just not getting the right signals to calm them down from the gut. So many other potential things that have changed, depending on where you see that, if you see that our gut microbes have changed so dramatically in the last 100 years compared to the last few million, it sort of makes sense, whereas our immune cells probably haven't.
Tim, I know you're a big fan. We've talked about the diversity. We want to get at least 30 different plants in per week to keep our microbiome healthy. I know you're not a big fan of labeling certain foods as superfoods, but are there certain heavy hitters when it comes to these polyphenols, fiber, certain foods people might want to consider as part of that 30 on a regular basis that are especially good for the gut?
Yeah, the book goes into this in a fair bit of detail. There are tables outlining what the best ones are. Your best bang for your buck is to combine fiber and polyphenols together, right? So you sort of covering your bases. And so, I've listed coffee as an unlikely one, right? Most people wouldn't call that a superfood, but it does increasingly looking like one. Then you've got a whole range of berries, and the humble blueberry, which, is ubiquitous, does pretty well. You don't have to get some Peruvian superberry just to be good. Something like a blueberry, a blackberry, a raspberry, all of these are good. You freeze them when they're in season, and they are perfectly good in terms of the polyphenol and fiber count when you defrost them. So there are a few easy tips that you can use year round, for breakfast or on your salads or whatever. We have nuts and seeds, which are inexpensive and hugely good in terms of fiber and polyphenol counts. And you can get a lot of variety by using different ones. And I always keep a big jar of mixed seeds and nuts in my kitchen that I'm always replenish when I find some new nut or seed. I just put it in. And again, you don't have to go for the expensive superfood, trendy seed of the month. It's the variety that's really important there. And I think what I discovered actually, there's much more to mushrooms than meets the eye. And I think I had been really underestimating mushrooms. And I think mushrooms are a pretty good superfood, that they're really high in protein content, they're really high in fiber, and they're more like animals than plants, interestingly, when you look at them genetically. And there are hundreds of different edible varieties that will give you a gut microbiome a rich variety. So I think their suits also become, when you ferment them, they become really good meat alternatives of the future. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot more about mushrooms. And interestingly, of all the plants I saw that had amazing claims for them, I think it was mushrooms that came out top in terms of helping chemotherapy in cancer and in lowering blood pressure, etc. Really convincing studies. So I think my message is that don't get fooled by the advertising and go for the most expensive, exotic tropical seed or berry or plant, many of them, under our noses, and we need to use it and just, have a look and see if there's any data on the fiber. If you can get something on the polyphenol counts, but you can't go far wrong if berries, nuts and seeds and mushrooms would be the top of my list. But, there are plenty of others. And of course, what I want people to do is to go out there and be adventurous and find different ones every week. Don't get stuck on the same berry. That's a route to isolation.
Now that you're done my conversation with Tim, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Dr. Gundry. He's going to teach you the top foods and supplements to transform your health. I'll see you over there.
I unfortunately think that most of the recommendations from the American Heart Association on diet